Hi, thanks everybody for being here tonight. Thank you, Chelsea, for the nice introduction. So as Chelsea mentioned, originally I lived in Oregon and I was a fire ecologist there. So I got to play around in the woods, burning it up and studying vegetation, how vegetation responds to forest fires. Tonight though, I'm going to talk about my research in Brazil, where I've been studying the ecological effects of habitat fragmentation. So I'm going to pose a question: what is biodiversity? So this is one of those buzz terms that we hear a lot when we listen to the radio or we read newspapers or look at magazines. But biological diversity is basically looking at the variety of life at all different levels. And we can do that looking at a molecular level with genetic variation. So this is looking at DNA and RNA and seeing how these genes code for different traits. Another unit of biological diversity are species. And here's a cute little monkey, which is an endangered species. So species are another unit of biological diversity that we can study. When we start to get groups of species together, or populations as we call them in ecology, they form communities. So these populations start to interact with each other. And then at the highest level of biodiversity, we have ecosystems. So at this point, we're taking all of our communities in one area at one time, and then we're adding in all the non-living components of our environment, such as temperature, rain, the geology, precipitation, and those are ecosystems. Now, the question arises, why do we care about biodiversity? Well, genetic variation is extremely important. It's the genetic variation that allows populations to adapt to changing environments. So this is very important. So over long periods of time, what happens is these populations change to their environments. We get natural selection, adaptations, and populations evolve to live in their environments. So I have kind of a mock population down here. So we have population 1 and we have population 2. Population 1 has red genes and blue genes. Population 2 only has blue genes. So we can see that this one has more genetic diversity. Let's say we have some type of environmental change that selects for the red genes. So with this change, we only have red individuals left in the population. Since this population don't have the red genes, they go extinct. So this is kind of a very simplified model of why genetic variation is important. Why are species important? Well, many of them are ecologically and economically important for us. So I put the 4 main crops that we grow here in the United States. So these species are very important. We eat them, and they're very important economically. So we have corn, which is very important. This is our #1 crop we grow in the US. We also have soybeans. That's our #2 crop. Wheat is #3, and cotton is #4. So this is just an example of 4 very important species for humans. Now, why are communities important? So community interactions are very economically and ecologically important. For instance, let's take the honeybee. Here's a honeybee on a blossom of a peach. This is one of those community actions, interactions that we talk about. This is a mutualistic relationship where the bee pollinates the flower and the bee then takes pollen away and can make nectar from it. We can see over here that soybeans rely 50% on honeybee pollination for them to become pollinated. This is a $20 billion industry in the United States alone. So this has direct economic implications looking at community interactions. And there are thousands, millions more that we could talk about, but I'm just kind of giving this one as an example tonight. Why are ecosystems important? Once again, they're ecologically and economically important. I'm going to talk about what we call ecosystem services. So these are services that the ecosystem provides for humans and for wildlife. Some of these overlap with some that I've already talked about, but groundwater recharge is a very important ecosystem service. Thermal regulation, very important. This is why we plant trees down in New York City to try to regulate the thermal, the heat island effect of New York City. Water quality management, water supply. Ecosystems provide fish and wildlife habitat. They sequester carbon from the atmosphere. They provide food and timber, stormwater management and erosion control. And additionally, recreation, aesthetics, cultural and spiritual resources as well. So when you go out and hike, people go out and enjoy nature. So these are all ecosystem services. Unfortunately, biodiversity is threatened, mainly by humans. The major threat is habitat loss. And generally, you can think about it as we have one type of habitat and we convert it into something completely different. Deforestation is a great example, and that's what I'm showing up here. So here we have Amazon rainforest. It's been deforested. It's no longer a rainforest. Often, habitat loss leads to habitat fragmentation. This is where we take a large habitat of some type and we convert it into smaller, more isolated habitat patches or fragments. The other threats to biodiversity include climate change, pollution, overexploitation, and invasive species. And tonight I'm going to focus mainly on habitat fragmentation. So here again is habitat fragmentation. So you can think of it as the green is a forest, and you can see over time this forest gets smaller and smaller, and the patches of the fragments that are left are more and more spatially isolated. This is classic habitat fragmentation. Now, habitat fragmentation affects biodiversity in specific ways. First, it creates smaller isolated populations, so we're going from a big population to something smaller, and that increases the risk of extinction. It lowers genetic variation, so we might not have individuals of any given population moving between these two fragments, so we're losing genetic variation because the individuals that are left here might start inbreeding, and that's not good for genetic diversity. It can also disrupt species interactions. So the bees that pollinate a tree over here might not fly across these sugarcane fields anymore. So whatever relies on the bees over here will not get pollinated. And it also lowers ecosystem services. So we get less carbon sequestering, we get more erosion, more water runoff, and we start to lose those services that a fully intact ecosystem provides. Now, ecosystems have been undergoing habitat fragmentation and habitat loss for a long time. As conservation ecologists, we tried to prioritize these, and a list came out in 2000 that had the hot spots of biodiversity conservation. So these are areas that have extremely high diversity and endemism. So endemism means that the species that live there are found nowhere else on Earth. They're endemic to that area. And these areas have also lost over 70% of their vegetation, so not much of it is left. You can see one that we had here in the United States is the California floristic province over in California and a little bit up down in New Mexico and a little bit up into Oregon. I'm going to talk about Brazil's Atlantic forest tonight. This is one of the biodiversity hotspots. It's actually ranked 4th on the list because it has such high species diversity and high endemism. But before I talk about the Atlantic forest, I just want to talk about Brazil a little bit. Most of the time when people hear Brazil, they think of the Amazon. And it's true, the Amazon does cover a lot of Brazil. It's the largest rainforest on Earth. But there are also different habitat types. We have the Pantanal, which is the largest tropical wetland in the world. We have the Pampas down here in southern Brazil, which is a flat grassland. We have a very dry savanna-like habitat here in central Brazil. And then we also have a thorn forest up here, which it's a very scrubby, dry, thick, deserty type forest. And then we have the Atlantic forest that runs along the coast. So just keep in mind, Brazil is a very large country. It's about the size of the lower 48 states. Has a very extensive coastline, and this is where the Atlantic forest is found. Because this coastline is so extensive, there's a lot of heterogeneity, or there's a lot of variation in the geology, in the climate, in the soils, and in the organisms that live there. So there are really different regions to this Atlantic forest. So here again here's Brazil. This is the state of Bahia right here, darkened. And I'm talking about this southern region right here, which you can see right here. This is southern Bahia. Indigenous people have lived there for thousands of years. At least 12,000. There are different hypotheses. I'm not going to get into all those. But when they colonized there, they were mainly hunters and they were shellfish gatherers. So there's a very rich ecosystem of mangroves along the coast, and they would collect shells, mainly oysters there. And they found middens of shells, which are where they would shuck the oysters and eat them. They would then throw the shells out. They're literally 10 meters tall in some places, so they really exploited the shellfish there. About 1,500 years before present, these folks developed swidden agriculture. So this is where they would go in and they would burn a small patch of the Atlantic rainforest and they would plant manioc. And manioc was the staple crop, and in this area it really still is a staple crop. It's in the rubber family. It's poisonous if it's not treated correctly. If you've ever had yucca fries or tapioca, that's made from manioc. In this region of Brazil, they make it a million different ways, and it's really tasty. So these folks were definitely disturbing the forest for a long time. Not majorly fragmenting it, but they were using the forest. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral and his Portuguese crewmen landed in southern Bahia. So this is where the Portuguese originally landed when they came to Brazil. At this point, when they made contact with the indigenous people, things started to change drastically in Brazil, culturally and ecologically. And this is really when habitat fragmentation started to happen in Brazil. Currently, in the Atlantic rainforest, so here we see Brazil. This gray section is the original extent of the Atlantic rainforest. About 100 million people live in this area. There are some major metropolitan areas here. We have Recife up here, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo, just to name a few that you might have heard of. So there are major cities there. Because most of the people live in this coastal area, you can see the remnants of what is left of the forest. So the dark little spots here are what's left. There's only about 12% left of this forest. 80% of it are fragments under 50 hectares, so that's about 125 acres. Despite this fragmentation, though, there's still over 20,000 plant species found there. About 40% of them are endemic, so they're only found in the Atlantic rainforest. You wouldn't find them up here in the Amazon. There's almost 1,300 or almost 1,400 vertebrate species, and almost 600 of them are endemic. So because, how I was saying, there are different areas to this Atlantic rainforest, a group of researchers came together and they thought that there might be specific conservation priority areas within this Atlantic forest, because this area is so much different than here. And in fact, they found that this region in southern Bahia is very biologically important. It has extremely high species richness. Colleague of mine, Wade Thomas, at the New York Botanical Garden found over 450 tree species in 1 hectare. So this is 2.5 acres of land with over 450 tree species. This is some of the highest tree diversity on Earth. And just to compare with here in eastern North America, we only have about 250 total tree species. So it's really, really diverse. There's also really high endemism here as well. So these are trees only found there. About 42% are only found in the Atlantic rainforest, and almost 30% are only found in this little region right here. Here's some other interesting diversity from the area. So this southern Bahia is also very diverse in bromeliads. They have some of the highest diversity there. There are also blue-headed parrots. There are a lot of interesting butterflies. Many of them are endemic. There are these really weird earthworms that are about this long and bright blue, and when they're slithering through the forest next to you, you think they're a snake. They're pretty weird. Here's a little frog. You can see how it blends in here with the leaves, how it's hiding. Here's another little tree frog that we found. This was actually sitting on our car when we were getting ready to leave, and then we put him on a leaf and put him back in the forest. Interesting mushrooms, and there are also big scary spiders that eat bats down there. So there are all kinds of interesting critters in this area. So the fragmentation in southern Bahia has been pretty recent. As you can see here, so in 1945 there was still quite a bit of forest left. And we can see here in the early 70s it really started to get fragmented. And if we look here, you can see these red lines, those are roads. And in the early 70s, the Brazilian government finished the Brazilian Coastal Highway, the BR-101, right here. And once they built that, it really opened up this area for exploitation. So it made it easier to go in and start logging. Only about 18% of it remains. 95% of it is under 100 hectares. So this is under 250 acres. So they're pretty small parcels. But I want to draw your attention up here. You can see these fragments are a little bit bigger than the ones down here. This is the chocolate growing region of Brazil, and they grow chocolate there using a shade growing method. It's called cabruca. So they leave the forest, they leave the trees, they go in and they clear out the undergrowth, and then they plant the chocolate shrubs underneath. So they actually retain a lot of the ecosystem services by using this type of agriculture. Over in this area, it's a little bit drier. This is more where they grow soybeans, sugarcane, and coffee. So they don't need shade for that. So they pretty much have cut down most of the forest. And then down here, it's mostly eucalyptus plantations, and they don't use shade for that. They actually, the eucalyptus trees they grow in this region, they can grow them to be about this big for timber quality in about 12 years. So it's some of the best eucalyptus growing habitat on Earth. So because of this fragmentation, this is a really good area to study habitat fragmentation because it's so fragmented, there's a lot of species diversity, and there's high endemism. So we know that biodiversity is economically and ecologically important. So understanding how fragmentation affects the ecology of these forests is important from a management perspective. That way we can better manage these forests for sustainable use. And it's also important for science-based conservation initiatives. My research in Brazil uses ecological data. So I go out and I collect ecological data and I kind of see, who's eating this tree and eating the fruits and throwing the seeds around. I use genetic data, so I go out and I collect samples from the trees and then I come back to the lab and I run this out on gels and I look at the DNA and I look at population genetics. And then I also use spatial data. So I take this data and I put it into GIS and I use maps to try to answer ecological questions. And these are all based, and I'm trying to look at to see what are the effects of habitat fragmentation in this area. So to do that, I picked a tree species. I'm going to talk about one tonight. It's called Manilcra maxima. It's in the Sapitaceae family. It's on the IUCN Red List. So the IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they're the ones who come out and say this is an endangered species, this one isn't endangered. They have listed Manilcra maxima as vulnerable, meaning that it's at high risk of extinction, mainly due to habitat fragmentation. You can see here that the tree is quite large. It can grow to 30 meters in height. It can get pretty big, about a meter in diameter. The wood is extremely dense, and it also has latex in it. Any of you who have ever had a root canal and had the rubber that they stick in down in there when they do a root canal is called gutta percha, and it is from another Sapitaceae tree. That Sapitaceae tree is from Southeast Asia, but this tree also has latex. So because of this latex and because of the density of the wood is very resistant to fungus, and it's also resistant to insects, so it's very good for building. So it'd be nice to use it for beams like this in Brazil so you don't get termites in there or it molds over time because it's so damp. So it's economically important as a timber species, and people actually go out and selectively log it, even though it's illegal to cut trees down in this area. So sometimes they go out and cut these down, and this was actually a tree from my study site. It's ecologically important because the fruits are eaten by different primates and birds. The flowers have little nectaries in them. So on the bottom of them, they produce nectar, and two different primates come down and they eat the nectar out of these flowers. And it makes up about 20 to 30% of their dietary nectar, so it's a big proportion of it. When they do that, they eat the nectar, they get pollen on their whiskers. This guy right here, the golden-headed lion tamarin. Then these golden-headed lion tamarins have the pollen on their whiskers. They jump from tree to tree, and then this is how these trees get pollinated, by these little monkeys. This monkey is endangered, And Menilcra maxima has been identified as the 4th most important tree species for golden-headed lion tamarin conservation, because these little monkeys like to live up in these trees. They sleep up there. They root around in these other plants that grow on the trees and drink water out of them, or they eat little insects out of there. So it's a really interesting tree. It's also a little bit easier to find in the forest than most of the trees down there because the leaves are pretty big. That's given the name maxima, meaning big, so it has these big leaves. Most of the trees down there look very similar, and when you're looking for one tree with 450 different tree species, it's kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack. So I'm going to talk about, I divided these trees into 2 life stages, adults and saplings. So the adult trees are trees that are over 1 centimeter in dBH, meaning their diameter at breast height. So right here, they're about 1 centimeter or bigger. The saplings are smaller than that, but they're over 20 centimeters in height, because anything under 20 centimeters, if you're walking through this dense forest, it's really hard to see. And you don't want to be digging around on the ground because of bees and spiders and snakes and stuff like that. And also, the main reason though I chose this is that tropical trees less than 1 centimeter are estimated to be less than 20 years old, and since the fragmentation was in the early 70s, this allowed me to conservatively estimate that these trees established after fragmentation and these trees before fragmentation. So then I could see what's happening with trees that were there before the forest was fragmented and trees after it was fragmented. And then that allows me to answer some questions about, hey, what is forest fragmentation doing to these trees? So I went down to Brazil. This is very similar. This is kind of what the forest looked like. This is a little bit south of where I was. This is all sugarcane growing around here. Like I was saying, when you're looking for trees in a forest that's so diverse, any given species is very rare. So there's a lot of walking around in the woods looking for these things, and it can be pretty tedious. There are things that you have to look out for, like pit vipers. We did see a pit viper. My wife almost got bit by it, but luckily she got around it. There are things like wasps that attack you, and this was actually a wasp nest that we bumped, and it did attack us. There are a lot of ticks. You can see here, those are all ticks on her pant leg. Luckily, they don't have Lyme disease down there, or we would have been in trouble. You basically have to take duct tape down your pant leg to get those off. Every once in a while, you find something nice. Here we found a nice bromeliad growing in a tree. And when you're out there long enough, you go a little bit crazy. But that's usually when you start finding the trees. So we set up 3 study sites in this forest. This green is the range of Menilcra maxima. So it grows from this little fishing town called Itacaré down here to Prado. Porto Seguro is actually where Cabral first landed when he hit Brazil. So this is where the Portuguese first colonized. So the northern site is Nova Esperança. It is about 250 acres of privately owned land that people graciously let us use. The Una Eco Park is an eco park that is managed by a nonprofit organization. It's about 400 hectares. And then the Lemus Maya is an experimental station owned by the government, and it's managed to do agricultural experiments, mainly with chocolate, coconuts, different types of palm trees. And the Lemus Maya is my fragmented site. And this is what it looks like. So I was interested in seeing how fragment size affects biodiversity. So the Lemus Maya site had 25 hectare fragments, 10 hectare fragments, and 5 hectare fragments. So in the 25 hectare fragments, I only sampled 10 hectares out of them, and that's what those squares are. And then I had 2 10 hectare sites, and then 3 5 hectare sites. So we went out, we counted the trees, we mapped them with the GPS. We collected tissue for DNA. On the big trees, what we would do is we would cut a little plug out of the bark, and we would scrape the cambium and put it in silica gel. That way it dries it out right away. With smaller trees, we would take a little bit of the leaf and put it in the silica gel, and then it dries out, and then we can take that back to the lab and then do our DNA analysis, very similar to what you see on CSI or a program like that. We built these seed traps out in the forest to collect fruits and seeds. We went out and looked at those every week, so it's kind of like going out and seeing what kind of goodies you have in the basket, and you need to watch out for tarantulas and other things that like to live in there. And then each tree had 10 of these seed traps at different distances, so then I could see how far away these seeds were being dispersed away from the tree, so I could then kind of tell what are these monkeys and birds actually doing with the fruits and seeds. So I'm going to talk about 3 main research questions tonight. So the first one was, does fragment size affect the abundance of Dalton saplings? So I was wondering, are there more trees in big fragments, or are there less trees in small fragments? The second question was, does fragment size affect the genetic diversity of a Dalton sapling? So again, I was interested to see if fragmentation has declined the genetic diversity of the trees that established after these places were fragmented. And then my third question was, does fragment size affect fruit production and seed dispersal? So I wanted to see if the monkeys and birds were in there basically pollinating the flowers and then also dispersing the seeds away from the trees. Some of this research is published, some of it is in the January volume of Endangered Species Research, some of it is in the September issue of the Journal of Tropical Ecology, and some of it is in press right now. So here's what I found. I found that density increased with fragment size. So there were more trees in bigger fragments, and that kind of makes sense. The bigger area you have, you would expect there to be more trees. And that was true for adults and for saplings. So bigger fragments, more trees. For the genetic diversity though, I found that fragment size did not affect genetic diversity. So there were small fragments that were just as diverse and sometimes even more diverse than the big fragments. So this was kind of odd. But what I did find was that density affected genetic diversity. So I'm going to jump back because some of these medium-sized fragments actually had higher density, and you can see that here too. And that's what affected this right here then. So some of these fragments, the smaller fragments that had high densities also had high genetic diversity. So all small fragments might not be bad because some can have high genetic diversity. I found that fragmentation did not affect fruit production. So these are my 3 sites down here. These are the 2 big ones. This is the fragmented site. This is the number of fruits per tree. And we can see here that these lines all overlap, and that tells me that, hey, they're not different. So big fragments, small fragments, medium fragments, they're all producing the same amount of fruits. And I found that 62% of the fruits were handled by vertebrates. So they would look like this. So the monkeys were up there eating these things. And that's quite a bit. So, you know, over half of these fruits and seeds are being handled by vertebrates, regardless if they're in small fragments or large fragments. And then I also saw that most of the saplings were out in these areas of low seed density. So I'm not going to try to make this too confusing. What I did is I took seeds that were falling, and I assumed that if seeds were falling here, that that's where saplings should be, because if you have seeds, you would expect there to be young plants. And I mapped this, but what I found was that all the saplings were out here in areas where there weren't very many seeds. So that's telling me, well, how are they getting out there? The monkeys and the birds are taking them away and dropping them out there. So that's good, because this also was true at our fragmented site. So that means dispersal is happening even though these sites are fragmented. So all in all, this tree seems to be doing okay in small fragments. Why? This is, goes against all the predictions. One of the reasons could be sustainable use of natural resources in the area. So these forests grow these palm trees called piassava. So they leave the forest intact a lot of times, even the small forest, and they don't go and cut down a lot of the trees or hunt, because they can make, these local folks can make enough money collecting this palm fiber. They can then go back and they make these, they make jewelry out of it, and they make different crafts out of it, and then they can sell it, and it's pretty popular. Tourists buy it, a lot of people wear it. Even in Fashion Week in Sao Paulo, 2 years ago, they used Piassava palm fibers on their, as part of the decorations for this fashion show. Also, how I was talking about the shade-grown chocolate, here we can see shade-grown chocolate being picked. So you can see this giant tree right here. So they leave the big trees and then they grow the chocolate underneath. And actually the golden-headed lion tamarins actually like to use these areas just as much as they do the forests that haven't been touched. And here is a golden-headed lion tamarin sitting on a chocolate tree. So they use these just as much as the native forest. So the main conclusions were that larger forests have higher tree densities. Density was a better predictor of genetic diversity than fragment size. Some of the small forests exhibit high tree densities and high genetic diversity, and that vertebrate dispersal is very important for this species. Conservation implications: it's important to conserve large fragments because this is where we found most of the trees. However, small fragments are also important because we still could find a lot of trees in some of them and a lot of genetic diversity. So I recommended to some nonprofits that, some of these small fragments are important to conserve if you're going to spend money trying to buy land. And conservation of mutualistic species are critical to preserve these plant-animal interactions. So this is a community-based question. So we want to try to conserve the trees and the monkeys. That way the trees are there to provide the monkeys with the flowers, and the flowers can then get pollinated by the monkeys. I have a lot of people to thank for this. This took a lot of funding to go to Brazil for a year and a half to do this kind of research. So Fordham was very generous. The New York Botanical Garden was very generous. Fulbright was very generous. The University of Santa Cruz, ESB, CIPLACI, and the Una Eco Park in Brazil were the three, all helped me on the ground. I had a lot of field assistance. My wife was with me in the field every day, so without her, this wouldn't have happened. She knows just as much about this as me. Thanks, and I'll take any questions. Yes, Chelsea.
Seth, what was the criteria for determining if the seeds had been handled by the monkeys? Like, did that have to be split open, or were there like scratches?
Good question. So yeah, so some of them had scratches in them. Those usually had little bites, which were the tamarin bites. Some of them were scored by birds. So this is when a bird will take a berry in its mouth, usually a toucan or a parrot, something with a large beak, and it spins it, and it basically chops it in half. So I was looking to see if they had bird marks or monkey marks, basically. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
The amount of original forest is so vast compared to what's there now, the fragmented forest. Yet we can still feed and produce what we need in that little fragmented area. And I'm just wondering if we needed more, food or products or whatever they're getting from the forest now. I mean, would they be able to replant or regrow that forested area? Are they doing that?
Yes.
Successfully?
Yes. So actually the forest there, it comes back pretty fast.
Oh, it does.
It does. And they've actually found, for instance, the species that I was talking about tonight, Menilcra maxima, has been found in forests that are regenerating and that were about 20 years old. And they didn't think that they would find it there because it's a slow-growing old tree. It's kind of an old-growth tree. It's something you would expect to find later. But they were finding it right away.
Right.
So it does grow back pretty fast. And there's a lot of secondary forest there as well that's coming back because more and more people are letting land go back. Their economy has done well, so that takes a lot of pressure off. Because conservation, it's a luxury.
It'd be interesting to see how much of an area a given population would need, to grow and prosper and stuff like that. Just make sure that balance is maintained.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think that's one of the interesting things, because I mean, I did find it, hey, you know, these small forests, there are still trees there, so, you know, they're pretty resilient to fragmentation. And in a lot of those small forests, I didn't mention this earlier, there were no reproductively mature adult trees, just young trees. So they're being dispersed in there either by bats or birds, probably. So dispersal is happening. So they use, a lot of the animals use these fragments kind of as stepping stones. And it's nice there too, because the type of agriculture they do, it's a sustainable type of agriculture. So these animals can move easier through that matrix in between the fragments. They're more likely to go through a palm plantation rather than just something that's mowed down in like soybeans. So the way they farm there is kind of keeps things in balance. Thanks for listening.